Right, okay, good to see you all. So we're into June now, so it's not a new project. There's actually 5 weeks of June, so I'm going to try and get a few different things going. And I think towards the end, so this week I've done a little bit with watercolour and sort of gouache style watercolour, which is watercolour using white as well, more opaque style watercolour. So that'll be this week. And then I'll go on to something to do with like drawing buildings and structures perhaps in the next week. And then we could perhaps towards the end of the month do a little bit of lino printing if anybody's interested. So I think one or two people will be interested in that. So that'll be, yeah, towards the end of the month. But as I say, we've got 5 weeks. These are, yeah, these and these down here, my pictures from last week in Dorset. So I had a really nice time in Dorset last week. So that's good. But I thought we'd do a little bit on, today a little bit on watercolour and gouache. So quite often, this was a very quick one I did last week, and I quite like using watercolour more in this sort of, in my sketchbooks, more this kind of gouache style. So this was on the grey sketch pad, which works all right, but the paper's a little bit thin on this. In the past I've quite often used these brown ones, and it's quite absorbent paper, but it works quite well with a little bit, and it's slightly thicker paper, so I quite like sketching on those. Sometimes I'll go straight in with the paint, so these will just sketch very directly at the beach, drawing with the paint. Whereas other times I will draw out the scene quite carefully, either with, I think in this case it was pen, but it could be pencil or something like that. So I just get all the plot out where the windows and all the shapes are going to go. So it rather depends on what I'm going to be painting, how much drawing goes into it. So that's, a couple of examples. Again, slightly smaller one, similar sort of thing. It's a medium, so when I first started painting, I really started with oils when I was about 10 years old. And then when I was 13, I found this book in the library about gouache painting, and I'd never heard of it. So I asked for some gouache paints for my Christmas present, and I found them a really nice paint, and it's a bit like the powder paint we had at school, but better quality, nice quality, nice feel to it. So I found it quite a nice intuitive way of working, and it's really, the paints I'm using are really watercolour paints, but I've used a white gouache, so I can mix some white in. Whereas with proper pure watercolour painting, you tend to use the white of the paper showing through. Now, as I say, most of mine are painted in the sketchbook, brown coloured sketchbooks, and that's because I quite like working on tone. So for me, it's a bit more of a challenge to do this kind of painting on white paper. So I thought I'd give it a go. So this morning, that's my very quick sketch from that this morning. A little bit changed. So I've picked a fairly simple sort of subject to work with, and taped up roughly the shape. So I don't particularly want to make them too big. And part of the appeal to me of this medium is that I could probably do something quite quickly and fairly lightweight, whereas when I go out painting my oils, it's like a sort of 13 kilogram backpack, and it's quite involved, where this could be quite a lot lighter. So I think I really approach it the same way I would with oil paint. So I'll start with the sky. So I've got a little bit of cerulean, and it's the same as watercolour. Make sure you've got plenty of paint mix and ready. I'll add a little bit of white to this. So rather than just use the white of the paper, I'm going to add a little bit of white to lighten the colour. And work that in. Probably could go a bigger brush actually, which I haven't got handy, so I'll just carry on with what I've got. And that's perhaps a little bit too dark, so I'll just lighten that up a little bit as I go. Just try and get that in fairly quickly. And obviously the paint's going to dry quite quick, so as I say, a bigger brush would be better. And
does it dry quicker with the gouache then?
I think so. It's the same as watercolour really. It's sort of quite absorbent.
Oh.
I don't know. It probably wouldn't be too different from watercolour.
Oh.
So the clouds, I'll paint some of the clouds in. So it kind of working back to the foreground. So I'll mix a slightly darker, slightly greyish tone for the clouds. particularly the bottoms of the clouds. Now that, let's mix a bit more white in that. So again, in the distance it's small clouds. And this is something I've not really done before, which is just using my oil painting brushes, so slightly stiffer brushes than I generally use for watercolours. So I thought I'd experiment with those a little bit. And it's also, for me, very much an experiment for me, because it's although I've used it a lot in the past, I don't use it very much anymore. So I think what I do remember though is you've got, whereas with watercolour, once you've got the paint down, you can't really keep washing it out or not too much. With this, you probably could to an extent because you can overpaint. And then the highlights, I'll just go straight in with the white. There's a little bit of highlight in places. I mean, other people, like an artist like Turner quite often you'll find if you look at some of Turner's watercolours and sketches, he quite often worked on like a pale blue paper, and you'd use watercolours and then add a little bit of white. So it's that sort of idea. So that'll be that bit. These trees in the distance, they're quite green, so I'm going to use a green, but I'm going to make it a little bit greyer. And the reason being, something that's a long way away, if you can just soften the tones a little bit and desaturate the colour, it has the effect of pushing it back in space a little bit. So I'm adding a little bit of red and blue to that. So those trees in the distance can be there. Making this deliberately a little bit sketchy. I'll do a tiny bit more greens for that. Probably made that a little bit darker than it really wants to be. And then working forwards, these trees here, go back to the kit brush. I'll mix a green using, I've got some green and maybe a little bit of purple, just to make that darker. Again, that's a nice darkish green. And just using the corner of the brush just to suggest a few leaves on the edge of that tree. It wants to be a little bit darker actually, let's make it a bit darker in places. That's a bit better, a little bit of variety of tone. Then these purpley bits, I'll put those in next. So use got some magenta and a little bit of ultramarine. And I think some white as well. And there's also green there as well, some lighter bits. Just a little bit of green. Sort of greens, break it up a little bit, some of the greens. And it needs to be a little bit lighter, so some areas are in shadow, some of the shadows here. Some bits of shadow here and there. Bringing the shadow of that tree down as well. There. And a little bit of highlights on the top of the heather. Get some white in there. So for me, it's quite a nice sort of sketching medium, the sort of medium I could go outside with kind of get some painterly sketches together in similar sort of time that it would take me to do a pen drawing or something like that. That's probably a little bit too light. Let's darken that down a tiny bit. Yeah. Perfect. I think I'll be alright. Leave a bit of that. What I did with this one, which I don't normally do, but I've seen quite a lot of my friends doing this, is just use a little bit of masking tape to create a border, and then it can help at the end just to sort of present your work. But also, if I've got a whole sheet of watercolour paper and I don't want to use it all, just want to do a series of quicker sketches, just pulling the tape up with little frame the views. It's got to be careful you don't rip the paper, which is easy to do. Whoops.
Oh.
Actually doing that, sort of pulling it back on itself, you've got less chance of ripping it. Yeah.
It makes such a difference.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. It sort of frames it. I'll have to paint that in again. Okay, so it's an idea if you fancied working watercolour in a slightly, slightly more forgiving way. And as I say, you could, if things went wrong, you could probably wash bits out and repaint and not necessarily know that you've done that. Whereas with the pure watercolour, transparent washes, you're not going to see that. Any questions?
Do you always do the underside of the clouds first and then do the white over the top?
I probably would, yeah. Probably do the shadow side first, yeah. So this is really like an oil painting approach, sort of doing the darks first and working from dark to light. I guess this thing, I mean, if this had been oil paint, that would be wet, so it'd be quite hard to paint the clouds on top of that. Whereas because that dries really quickly, although they've sunk a bit, you can paint on it fairly quick. Yeah, acrylics, you could do it with acrylics. Yeah, so it'd be very light using acrylics. The only difference would be like if I wanted to wash an area back, you couldn't do it with acrylics, whereas you can with this. And just maybe slightly less to take out.
Versatile, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I could just go out with that amount. If I top these up, that would be enough paint to do a couple of little paintings. Whereas with the acrylics, I've perhaps got to take a look.
So are the colours ordinary watercolour and white?
Yeah. I've basically used ordinary watercolour and a bit of white gouache. So if you haven't got, years ago I used to have gouache paints, but they've pretty much run out now. And because I've got so many watercolours, I tend to just use the watercolours.
So that works, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it works fine. Yeah. So another idea of approach things if you wanted to.